Ever imagine a world where, like, I don't know, owning a rare Beanie Baby could make you wildly wealthy? Except it's not a toy, it's Bitcoin, and the stakes are way higher.
So it's all familiar, right?
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going deep on Bitcoin, especially its potential redistributive consequences. And get this, even if its price just keeps going up.
Okay, you've got my attention. Redistributive consequences, even with the price going up. I'm in.
We're diving into this research paper from the European Central Bank, and they don't hold back. They take this critical look at Bitcoin's evolution from its whole digital currency origin story to, well, what it's become, more of a speculative investment.
It's quite a jump from like digital cash in your pocket to digital gold.
Right. And this paper argues that if Bitcoin keeps climbing in value without any real economic benefit to back it up, well, there might be some surprising consequences. It's almost like that Beanie Baby in your attic suddenly making you a millionaire, but on a much larger scale.
Yeah, okay, I'm definitely intrigued. So how do they break it all down? How do they lay out this whole potential scenario?
So they start by rewinding things a bit, looking back at what Satoshi Nakamoto envisioned for Bitcoin. The whole goal was to create this decentralized digital payment system, right? Peer-to-peer transactions, cutting out the middleman, that whole thing.
Yeah, Bitcoin is this like revolutionary everyday currency.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The paper actually drops a pretty wild stat. They found that despite all the hype, less than 1%, and I mean less than 1%, of global transactions are actually done using Bitcoin.
Wow, less than 1%. So much for replacing the dollar anytime soon, huh?
Apparently not. The paper argues that while Bitcoin's design is innovative and all, it's actually kind of backfired. It's hindered its adoption for those everyday purchases, those real-world transactions Nakamoto envisioned. Yeah, not really happening.
Which kind of makes you wonder then, if it's not really used as a currency, what's driving its value? I mean, what are people actually buying into?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's like trying to figure out the fair value of, well, nothing really tangible. And the paper dives into this too.
I bet. I mean, it's not like you can just look up Bitcoin's price to earnings ratio or something.
Exactly. They talk about how people try to value it, like comparing it to gold, which is interesting, or using those super complex economic models. But their point is those methods don't really work for something like Bitcoin.
Okay, so how do they explain the Bitcoin craze then?
Well, they say it boils down to two things: speculation and hype. I mean, Bitcoin doesn't generate income like a company's stock would. It's not physically useful like gold, and it doesn't represent a piece of a company. It seems like its value is almost entirely based on this belief that it'll be worth more in the future, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
It's almost like a collective leap of faith.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting. The paper then goes on to explore what could happen because of this disconnect between Bitcoin's value and, any actual economic function. They call it a zero-sum game, which sounds kind of intimidating, honestly.
A little ominous, right? What does that even mean in this context?
So basically what they're saying is if Bitcoin keeps going up in value, but it's not leading to any new wealth being created, then every winner, so to speak, creates a loser. Meaning the gains of those early Bitcoin investors, yeah, those could very well come at the expense of people who buy in later or don't buy in at all.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see why this is a big deal. Can you give me an example? Like, how might this actually play out in the real world?
Imagine if there were only 21 million slices of pizza in the entire world.
Okay, now you're speaking my language.
Right. Now imagine just a handful of people snagged most of those slices early on. They're doing all right, right? But anyone else who wants a slice has to buy from those early adopters, and probably at a much higher price.
So the early birds get the pizza, and the latecomers are left with crumbs, even if, hypothetically, the pizza economy is booming.
Exactly. The paper argues that this pizza problem, that's basically what could happen with Bitcoin if the value just keeps rising on speculation
Yeah.
alone. And here's the thing, right? Even with this whole potential for disparity, you've got some pretty influential people who are all in on Bitcoin. Politicians, big financial institutions, even celebrities. It's kind of crazy, right?
Yeah, it's definitely become more mainstream. It's like it's gone from this niche thing to a full-blown cultural phenomenon, which I think the paper actually touches on. They make this point that despite all the economic arguments against it, Bitcoin just keeps attracting these true believers, people who are absolutely convinced in its future value.
Yeah, they're all about this digital gold narrative. But if it's not really being used as a currency in any significant way, how does that even make sense? It's like, I don't know, saying that Beanie Baby in your attic is actually like a hidden gold bar.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the paper actually points out that a lot of the rhetoric around Bitcoin, especially from some of these politicians who are pushing it, really tries to draw parallels between Bitcoin and gold. They point to its limited supply as this big reason why it's so valuable, or could be. The thinking is, just like gold, Bitcoin's scarcity means it'll inevitably become more and more valuable over time, which, on the surface, kind of makes sense.
Okay, I get that. But isn't that a little too simple? Like, just because there's not a lot of something doesn't automatically make it super valuable, right? What about its actual use? What about its role in the economy? I mean, a lot of things are scarce, but that doesn't mean they're a good investment.
Right, and that's a key point that the paper digs into as well. They're not saying scarcity doesn't matter. Of course it plays a role in determining value. It's not the only factor.
Hmm.
And it certainly doesn't guarantee that something's going to be a good store of value or the foundation of, like a stable financial system.
So, are these politicians just buying into the hype then? Or is there something I'm missing here about this whole digital gold thing?
The paper seems to suggest there's also a political angle to all of this. They bring up the 2024 U.S. presidential election specifically, with candidates on both sides trying to, appeal to voters who are into Bitcoin and the whole crypto world. That's a whole new voting bloc.
It's like they're all after that crypto vote now, which is kind of wild.
Clearly. And it's not just talk either. The paper points out that some candidates are even proposing some pretty big policy changes, like tax breaks for people who own Bitcoin, or even get this using Bitcoin as a national reserve asset.
Whoa, hold on. Using Bitcoin for national reserves? That sounds incredibly risky, like betting the whole country's savings on that Beanie Baby collection.
Yeah, it's definitely a bold strategy, and the paper basically argues that this push to bring Bitcoin into our traditional financial systems, even though it's so volatile and, let's be honest, doesn't have a very long track record, could have huge consequences.
It's starting to feel like we're all part of this high-stakes poker game where nobody really knows the rules and the stakes are, well, everything.
Yeah, and the paper does a pretty good job of illustrating how this might actually play out. They use this simplified model of an economy with two groups of people: the early birds, who, like the name suggests, got into Bitcoin early on, and then the latecomers, who are, just starting to invest.
Okay, so what happens in the model? I'm guessing it's not great news for the latecomers.
Not exactly. They found that if Bitcoin just keeps going up and up in price, the early birds, the ones who hold most of the Bitcoin, obviously see their wealth increase like crazy. They start spending more, buying up assets, really cashing in on this Bitcoin-driven boom.
And the latecomers, they're just struggling to keep up.
Pretty much. Because they own less Bitcoin, they see a much smaller wealth effect, even if they do manage to buy some. And in order to buy in, they might have to sell off other assets or cut back on their spending, which actually makes the whole wealth gap even worse.
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy where the early adopters just keep getting richer, not because of some amazing innovation or hard work, but simply because the price of Bitcoin keeps going up.
That's the concern the paper raises, yeah.
Yeah.
It's this idea that a huge chunk of global wealth could become tied to this digital asset that has no real intrinsic value, an asset driven purely by, well, speculation. And that could lead to even more wealth inequality and potentially, even some social instability.
It's like we're setting ourselves up for a world where, I don't know, the people who just happen to see the value in that Beanie Baby first are the ones who come out on top, not necessarily the ones who created something, actually valuable.
Yeah, and it kind of highlights this point that the paper makes. This isn't just about some lucky investors catching a break, right? It's bigger than that. It's about how this could actually change how we value things, how wealth is created, maybe even how our entire society functions.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack, but I see what you mean. Bitcoin is different. It's not a company, it's not a commodity, it's not even really a currency in the way we usually think of it, right? So how do we even begin to grasp what kind of impact it could have?
That is the million-dollar question. And the paper grapples with this too. They basically say that because Bitcoin is so new, so different, it challenges a lot of the traditional economic thinking. It's like a whole new ballgame.
So does that mean we're all just along for the ride? Just got to wait and see what happens?
Not necessarily. The paper doesn't say that Bitcoin's rise is a sure thing or anything. It's more like they're encouraging us to, think critically about what could happen, to look at the bigger picture.
When you say bigger picture, what do you mean?
Well, they want us to look beyond just the financial stuff, like what happens to people's wallets, what about the social and political side of things. What happens in a world where so much wealth is tied to this, well, kind of imaginary asset driven by, speculation?
You're talking about like what? More inequality, maybe some social unrest, even political instability.
Exactly. Imagine a world where the gap between the haves and have-nots just gets wider and wider, and it's all because of this digital asset that most people don't really get or even have access to. That's what has economists worried.
It's like we're on the verge of this massive economic experiment, and nobody really knows how it's going to turn out.
It kind of is.
Wow.
And this paper is like a wake-up call in a way. We can't just sit back and see what happens. We need to talk about this, about the good and the bad that could come from Bitcoin.
It's like that scene in a movie where the characters realize they're in totally uncharted territory, and they have to decide right then and there, do we turn back or keep going?
And just like in those movies, the decisions we make today about Bitcoin, those could have huge consequences down the road.
Well, that's definitely something to think about. As always, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you think about all of this? Is Bitcoin a force for good, a recipe for disaster, or something in between? Let us know. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.